Hello, best friends. How are you? I hope you had a great Halloween and that you're having a wonderful day. And thank you so much for once again joining me in our safe little space of the internet where we get to chill out and be our weird selves. If you are new here though and you've never seen this face before, then hi, hello, my name is Liz. And if you're into things like true crime and unsolved mysteries, then I'm so glad that you randomly stumbled across this video because that's what we talk about here. And I just think it would be great for you to stick around for a while. We can hang out, maybe even hit that subscribe button so that we can be best friends forever. Like if you want. So I hope you all are having a great week so far. How exciting is it that it's finally November and that Christmas is almost here? I know Halloween was like a week ago and I'm already like, oh my God, Christmas. But that's just how my brain works. And I always peak early every year. Everyone else will finally be excited on Christmas Eve and I'll be like, oh, that's still happening. I thought it was already February. Today, as usual, the real star of the show, Lily, will be joining us to offer top-notch emotional support. And heads up, today is one of those days where you're actually probably going to need it because today's case is it's a rough one. Luckily, Lily has a pretty good radar for these things and she will most likely pop up and give us a break if anything gets too intense. So today we're talking about a young boy named Craig Sorger, who was born to his parents, Chuck and Lisa Sauger, on the 10th of February 1990 in a town called Everett in Washington. Very early on in Craig's life, while he was still a toddler, his mother took him to the doctor because she had grown increasingly concerned with some of his habits and behaviors, and it was discovered at this point that Craig was on the autism spectrum. This meant that growing up, there were definitely some things that Craig needed extra support with and things that he struggled with. For instance, he didn't really like change, so when he was about 11 years old and his family moved from Everett to another small town in Washington called Ephrata, it took him a long time to adjust and settle in. Craig also experienced difficulties with activities that required a great deal of physical coordination, like sports and running, and he would often feel quite awkward in most social settings. So other than his brother Keith, who was a year younger, Craig really only had one close friend. But despite these struggles that Craig dealt with on a daily basis, a lot of his interests and personality traits were exactly what you would expect from a young boy in the 1990s. He liked Hot Wheels, video games, playing outside and messing around with wrenches and spanners while his dad, Chuck, who was a mechanic, fixed cars. Craig also had a really great sense of humor. He loved animals. He was very affectionate and also he was very technologically minded. His mum, Lisa, said that Craig could get the lights to work on an old broken VCR literally just by tinkering around with it. And he could also work out video games that virtually no one else in the family could. In early 2003, Craig celebrated his 13th birthday, and it was only a few days later, on the 15th of February, while he was just spending the afternoon chilling out at home with his family, that there was a knock on the front door of the Sauger house. The family hadn't been expecting any company, so when Lisa went to see who it was, she was surprised to see two young boys about her son's age that she hadn't ever met before. And she was even more surprised when they asked if Craig was home and if he could come out and play with them at Oasis Park, which was an RV park a couple of blocks away from their home. These two 12-year-old boys were Jake Eakin and Evan Savoie. Jake and Evan had known each other since they were about 2 years old and were best friends, depending on who you asked. Because if you asked Jake, he would say, yes, of course they were best friends. Whereas Evan, on the other hand, would say that Jake was like a step below best friend. So he called Jake his step friend. Gotta love those complicated childhood friendships, right? But these two boys were quite different, a bit like chalk and cheese. Evan was described as the class clown. He was outgoing and popular. But Jake, on the other hand, was definitely a little bit more subdued and, in his own words, a little troubled and angry. Jake and Evan were actually in the same special education classes as Craig and his brother Keith, and they had all played together a handful of times. But as we said, Lisa didn't know Jake and Evan, and there was a ton of reasons for her to tell these boys no, Craig couldn't come out and play. It was cold and wet outside. Craig was just getting over a cold, and she needed to go out and run errands. But she looked over at Craig, who was sitting right there listening to Jake and Evan invite him out with this huge smile on his face, just so full of hope and so excited because no one really ever came to the house and asked him to come out and play with them. It just didn't happen. And Lisa just knew there was no way that she could say no and disappoint him. So she told the boys that Craig could come out and play, but he needed to be home soon because she needed to go run her errands and it was going to be getting dark in the next few hours. And Craig, just beaming from ear to ear, gave Lisa a big kiss and hug and then ran out to play with Jake and Evan. From this point on, Lisa was, of course, keeping an eye on the time, anxiously waiting to see Craig come back down the driveway with that big grin on his face and happily tell her all about his afternoon, how much fun he had had. But time slipped by, and before she knew it, it was getting dark and there was no Craig. And Lisa became worried very quickly because not only had Craig promised her that he would be out for just an hour or two, but she knew he was afraid of the dark. He was never out after dusk. So if Jake and Evan were still at the park, she knew that Craig would have parted ways and anxiously rushed home well before it got dark. So Lisa headed out looking for her son, and after she couldn't find him at the park, the first place she went to was Evan's house. And just imagine her horror when she went there and found both Evan and Jake chilling out, playing video games, telling her that they hadn't seen Craig in hours. So then Lisa called 911 to report Craig as missing, and the police joined the search with her, as well as Evan and his parents, focusing on Oasis Park where the boys had played. This was a park that Craig had actually always been a little bit funny about because it had a few dark, secluded wooded trails that he had always been afraid of. And sadly, it was on one of these trails that they eventually found Craig. As soon as they spotted him, Lisa ran ahead of everyone where Craig was laying face down under a tree, just covered in blood. She told one of the police officers that he was still warm, but they quickly realized that it was too late. Craig had died hours ago, and right there in front of everyone present, including the police and Evan and his parents, before it was even clear how Craig had died, Lisa pointed right at Evan with tears streaming down her face and said, "It was him. He did this." You do have a good radar, don't you? Hey? Are you here for support? Such a good girl. Agreed. Guys, we don't deserve dogs. Being the last people that had seen Craig alive, Evan and Jake were both questioned that night by the police, and they both vehemently denied this accusation from Lisa and said that after playing with Craig for a while that afternoon, climbing trees, playing football and tackle tag, Craig had fallen and hit his head while they were tackling, and so he had left the park to go home at about 4:30 p.m. But as Evan's mother, Holly, was sitting there listening to police question her son, she looked down and noticed that Evan was no longer wearing the shoes he had been wearing when he came back from the park that afternoon. And the next morning, when she was gathering up laundry from the bathroom, she found the shoes that he had been wearing on the ground, soaking wet. Also, Evan's stepfather noticed that Evan had been missing his new sweatshirt when he came home from the park. And so they both confronted him, saying, "What's with the missing sweatshirt and the wet shoes?" And Evan just cracked. He sat them down and told them that he had lied to the police the night before. He and Jake had actually never seen Craig leave the park that afternoon. Instead, what really happened was that Craig had been climbing a tree when he fell from a really high branch. And Evan rushed over to help Craig, but he wasn't responding. And so he checked for Craig's pulse, listened for a heartbeat, and in the process got covered in a bunch of blood. But he soon realized that Craig was dead. So then, terrified that he and Jake would cop the blame for Craig's death, Evan jumped into a nearby pond, washed the blood off, and buried his sweatshirt in the muddy water. He even admitted to trying to steer Craig's family and the police away from Craig's body during the search because he didn't want to get into trouble. Holly, Evan's mother, listening to all of this, was just in total shock, and I think she probably considered covering for him, but instead she did the right thing. She called the police in tears and told them everything and brought in Evan's shoes to the station. Investigators then went and questioned Jake to see if his new story matched up with Evan's, which it mostly did, except Jake said that he and Evan had been in the tree with Craig at the time that he fell. Police went and searched the pond that Evan said he had jumped in to wash off the blood, and sure enough, they found his sweatshirt buried in the bottom, just covered in blood, just like he said. But then the results from Craig's autopsy came in. And despite what these boys were telling police, it wasn't a fall that had killed Craig. Craig had been severely beaten pretty much all over his body, especially his head and neck. And he had been stabbed over 40 times in the back, chest, neck, and head with such brutality that a fragment from the knife used in the murder was found in Craig's skull. Investigators, of course, immediately searched the scene for the murder knife, but they were unable to find it. So clearly, everything these two boys had told police about Craig falling from a tree was just a complete lie. And just 3 days after Craig was murdered, Evan Savoie and Jake Eakin were both arrested and held on a $1 million bail each, which is huge. Two 12-year-old little boys being held on $1 million bails. That's how brutal Craig's murder was and how much of a threat to society Jake and Evan were considered by the law. But both of the boys continued to stick to their story that they had seen Craig fall out of that tree, and then believing he was dead and afraid that they would cop the blame, they had fled the scene, and their families stood by them, even going so far as to put forward a theory that after Craig had fallen from the tree and Jake and Evan had run off, some random person, or perhaps even a member of the Sauger family themselves, came across Craig laying there, and that this was the person that had beaten and stabbed Craig to death. This theory was, of course, a little bizarre and hard to believe, but was it any easier to believe that these two 12-year-old boys had brutally murdered their incredibly vulnerable 13-year-old friend with no apparent motive? No matter how you looked at it, it didn't make any sense. Evan and Jake were just two average, typical kids. They weren't obsessed with violent video games, their home lives were relatively normal, and they weren't troublemakers at school. But still, despite the boys continuing to claim that they were innocent, there was a ton of mounting evidence against them. Even though the blood on Evan's sweatshirt that had been recovered from the pond was unable to be DNA matched to Craig's, there was plenty of blood on his undershirt that was matched to Craig's, and more of Craig's blood was found on the cuff of Jake's jacket that he had been wearing that afternoon. And so the biggest decision that needed to be made before Jake and Evan's trial began was, were they going to be tried as juveniles, meaning that if they were convicted, they would only be held until they were 21, or would they be tried as adults and face a minimum of 20 years jail time each? The debate surrounding this decision was, of course, extremely heated, and everyone had very strong differing opinions. So to try and help the process leading up to the trial, the boys were interviewed by several different psychologists, and quite literally all of them said the same thing, that Evan and Jake were normal. One of them even went so far as to say that Evan was average in quote unquote virtually every way that can be measured. And Jake, while his IQ was on the low side around the 93 mark, and he had the language, writing, and reading skills of a 7 or 8-year-old, all of these experts found that Jake didn't have any major emotional or behavioral problems. A forensic psychologist named Eric Johnson interviewed both of the boys for several hours, and even though he had actually been hired by the prosecution who were pushing for the boys to be tried as adults, Johnson's advice to the judge was that Evan and Jake should be tried as juveniles. In his opinion, it was possible to rehabilitate them, and the treatment they would receive in the juvenile system would enable them to go on and live successful lives after serving out their sentences, whereas housing them with adult prisoners would just make them more dangerous. But despite this advice, the judge decided that the boys had little to no chance of rehabilitation in the juvenile system, and he ruled that Evan and Jake would instead be tried as adults. And this decision was upheld in February 2005 when the Washington Supreme Court refused to hear the case. So this made the boys the youngest people to be tried as adults for murder in the state of Washington since 1931. By now, 2 years had passed since Craig's murder, and Jake and Evan had been in juvenile detention awaiting trial all of that time, being amongst the youngest kids in there and yet also accused of one of the most serious crimes. And Jake obviously had a great deal of time to reflect and contemplate on what had really happened that day, because he changed his story again. Jake now claimed that while playing with Evan and Craig at the park, he had left for a short while to go and get some sodas. And he said that when he came back to the park, he saw Evan standing over Craig and attacking him before running over to that pond where his sweatshirt had been found and throwing something in the water. So police went and searched the pond again, and sure enough, they found a knife with a broken tip. This knife had obviously been in that pond for years, so they weren't able to obtain any blood evidence or fingerprints from it, but after testing, it was found that the broken tip from the knife matched the fragment that had been found in Craig's skull. So basically, despite having his friends back all of this time, Jake was now throwing Evan under the bus. But under intense questioning about this new version of events, Jake cracked and changed his story yet again. And I'm just going to warn you guys now that what I'm about to tell you is extremely distressing. And if you think you might need to, then maybe just skip forward a minute or two. I might even put the exact timestamp just here. But otherwise, if you're ready, let's talk about what Jake said really happened to Craig that afternoon. Jake said that afternoon he and Evan were just messing around at Oasis Park when out of nowhere, all of a sudden, Evan pulled a knife out of his pocket and said that he wanted to go on a killing spree. And apparently he went into great detail, like enthusiastically suggesting that they should first go and get Craig from his house and kill him, and then go and kill the owner of a trailer court near the park. So it sounds like Evan had been forming this plan of going on a killing spree for quite a while. After hearing all of this, Jake, for whatever reason, made the decision to join Evan, and they walked the couple of blocks to Craig's house where they innocently asked if Craig could come out and play. The boys then brought Craig back to Oasis Park where they played for a little while before Jake and Evan told Craig that they wanted to build a fort and took him to the wooded trail where his body would be found later that night. Jake said that Evan asked Craig to kneel down to check if the ground was wet because he didn't want to get his own shoes and clothes muddy. And he told Craig to check by touching the ground with his hand for 10 seconds. So Craig got down and started counting, and when he got to 9, Evan dropped a rock the size of a basketball on the back of Craig's neck. Craig fell face first to the ground, and at this point, Jake said that even though by his own admission he was in on the plan, he yelled at Evan to stop and tried to push him away, but at just roughly 70 pounds, he didn't really stand a chance against Evan, who shoved him to the ground and continued his attack on Craig. Jake said that during the attack, Craig shouted and screamed, asking Evan why he was doing this, and a couple of times he managed to get to his feet and make a run for the exit of the trail, but Evan caught him and threw him back to the ground and continued to strike him over and over about 30 or 40 times. Meanwhile, Jake was watching all of this with just this intense fear, remembering what Evan had told him about going on a killing spree, and all he could think to himself was, "I'm next, So after debating if he should just run away, Jake picked up a stick, and he said that his original plan was to use it to hit Evan, but as he approached, he knew he would be overpowered, and so he chickened out and instead used the stick to hit Craig over and over again until it broke. According to Jake, the entire attack lasted just minutes, and afterwards, while Craig was laying face down and motionless on the ground in a puddle of blood, Evan walked over to Jake and, without saying a word, gave him a bloody handshake. The two boys then left Craig lying there and walked to the pond, where Jake watched Evan bury his sweatshirt and throw something into the water. And I say something because Jake would continually claim that he never saw a knife in Evan's hand during the attack. On the walk back from the park to Evan's house, Evan casually said to Jake that they would probably be questioned by the police when Craig's body was found. And Jake said that this is when they came up with their original story, that they had last seen Craig when he left the park at 4:30 p.m. after he hurt his head during tackle tag.
Did your radar go off again, hey? What a sweet girl.
You are too clever, aren't you? You just checking in? Making sure everything's okay? Thanks, Lil. Hey, can you speak? With this new story from Jake, though, prosecutors finally had a version of events that matched up with the physical evidence, and they ran with it. They worked out a plea deal with Jake's lawyers that if he would testify in court against Evan, in return, his charge of first-degree murder would be downgraded to second-degree murder by complicity, and the prosecution would request the drastically lighter sentence of just 8 years jail time. And Jake, of course, agreed. But when he appeared in the Grant County Superior Court in April 2005, now 15 years old, he read his confession and pled guilty, and the judge stunned everyone in the courtroom by rejecting the recommended 8-year sentence and instead sentencing Jake to 14 years jail time, meaning that at age 18, he would be transferred from the juvenile system to an adult prison. The judge said that his reasoning behind this much harsher sentence was that he felt that Jake was smarter than his IQ of 93, and that even though there had been a lot of discussion about the boy's maturity at the time of the murder, he believed that by 12, you understand what it means to hurt and to hurt someone. Meanwhile, despite all of this, Jake's confession and just the mountain of evidence against him, Evan, now also 15 years old, was still maintaining his innocence, and his trial was very interesting. Some of the alternative murder suspects that his lawyers put forward included Craig's own father, Chuck, even though Chuck claimed that he was out of town that night, and they also tried to get their hands on Craig's child services file, attempting to pursue the theory that it had been his mother, Lisa, that had killed him. During all of this, as you can probably imagine, things were very heated and tense between Craig's family and Evan's family, to the point where both families had restraining orders against the other, each accusing members of the other family of harassing them by doing things like driving past their homes or places of employment and glaring and scowling. Another alternative suspect that Evan's defense team pointed the finger at was another 15-year-old boy who testified at Evan's trial named Cody Cook. And on the stand, Cody not only claimed that he had been Craig's best friend, but also that he had witnessed the murder itself. So Cody, who had a juvenile record of his own, told the jury that he had heard fighting in the park that afternoon, so he had gone to suss it out, and while hiding in a bush, he witnessed Evan and Jake hitting and stabbing Craig, and absolutely terrified that if he jumped in to save his friend, that the two boys would attack him as well. Cody said he waited until they walked away and then ran over to help, but by then, of course, it was too late. Now, if you'll remember, Evan's family had always argued that someone else had come across Craig after he had fallen out of a tree, like Evan and originally Jake claimed, and that this person had been the one that had killed him. So Evan's defense team, of course, jumped to very quickly point out that Cody was in the habit of carrying a knife on him. And sure enough, when he was questioned on the stand, Cody admitted that the day Craig was murdered was no different. It was also revealed that Craig's blood had been found on Cody's clothing. So the question was Cody telling the truth? Had he gotten this blood on him when he was trying to help Craig after Evan and Jake attacked him? Or was Cody lying? What if he was really the one that had killed Craig and now he was letting Jake and Evan take the fall? Cody's parents took the stand as well, and while his father said that he didn't personally see any change in Cody's demeanor after Craig was murdered, his mother testified that she had seen a huge change in her son after that day. But even if his mum was right, this still didn't mean that Cody wasn't telling the truth. He could have just been dealing with the trauma and most likely a massive amount of guilt after standing by and watching his best friend get murdered. In the end, though, even though he had received a much harsher sentence than he expected, Jake followed through with his agreement and testified against Evan in court for a total of 2 hours. And this proved to be the nail in Evan's coffin. Even though the defense brought up Jake's constant changes in his story and the fact that he claimed he had never even seen a knife in Evan's hand during the attack, Jake's testimony, along with the physical evidence uncovered during the investigation, was enough to convince the jury, who deliberated for 3 days and then delivered their verdict that Evan was guilty of the first-degree murder of Craig Sorger. Evan was given the maximum sentence available, which was 26 years, which, I know I've said this already, but it's huge, right? A 15-year-old being sentenced to 26 years in prison. This conviction was overturned 6 years later in 2011 based on the grounds that Evan's right to a public trial had been violated because the judge had chosen to restrict certain parts of the trial to the public. When the prosecution announced that they were going to push for a retrial, Evan, then 23 years of age, pled guilty to second-degree murder. And in 2014, he was sentenced to 20 years jail time. And I'm just going to be totally honest here and say that I can't really tell if he's still in prison. Literally half the sources that I found say that Evan is still serving his time at Airway Heights Correction Center in Washington and is due to be released in 2034. But meanwhile, the other half of sources say that he was released last year in June 2020. And I don't know what to believe, but this brings us to what separates these cases where the perpetrators are very young from the majority of cases where the perpetrators are adults. Because aside from these cases being obviously incredibly disturbing, these people, after they serve their sentences, they aren't old and decrepit and in their twilight years. No, most of them are still in their prime and have half a life left in front of them. So what happens there? For instance, Evan, if he was released in 2020 like some claim, then he was only roughly 29 years old, basically still a baby. But even if he is still behind bars and he doesn't get out till 2034, he would still only be 44 years old. And I mean, considering that I can't even really tell if he's still in prison or not, if he has been released, we can assume that he is probably going to stay under the radar and hopefully just live a quiet life, right? But I don't think we can say the same for Jake. Firstly, after Evan was sentenced to 26 years in prison for first-degree murder, Jake decided to write Evan's mum a letter in which he changed his story for a 4th time, now claiming that he was the sole murderer and that Evan was going to pay the price for his crime. I'm going to read a portion of this letter now, remembering that at this point, Jake had the reading and writing ability of a much younger child. Jake wrote, "I stabbed Craig Sorger. I planned the murder and I switched clothing with Evan at the crime scene. His bloody clothing are mine. And now a kid is going down for what I did." So this letter didn't really go anywhere because it was too late. Evan had already been sentenced and found guilty, but the letter did happen. And Jake then went on to get in a lot of trouble during the first half of his prison sentence, resulting in him spending the majority of his time in solitary confinement, which Doesn't sound amazing. This young teenage boy spending months upon months in solitary, but eventually Jake decided that this wasn't how he wanted to spend his time in jail, and he kind of pulled his neck in and started playing by the rules. Eventually, towards the end of his sentence, he did I believe it was an auto mechanic course, and he was put on work release. But according to Jake, this work release was just too much too soon. You know, he had been behind bars since he was 12 years old, and all of a sudden, he had all of this freedom and responsibility that he didn't know how to deal with. And so in 2016, literally just 90 days before he was due to be released, Jake escaped from a work release facility in Yakima, Washington. He then hitchhiked 300 miles to Idaho and traveled by bus to Rapid City, South Dakota. But when he stepped off the bus, he came face to face with a group of US federal marshals, all pointing guns at him, who then extradited him back to Yakima, Washington. And Jake was up for an extra 5 years to be added to his sentence, but he ended up getting lucky, and instead he only served an extra 6 months. And during his remaining months in jail, Jake says that he became an avid reader, specifically of the Bible. In fact, he says he read the Bible cover to cover a total of 7 times during this period, and he became a born-again Christian. It was also during these final months of his incarceration that romance bloomed in Jake's life, because over the years while Jake had had visitors that came and went, one of these visitors had been particularly loyal, and he looked forward to seeing them every time. Marissa Spitex had been a family friend of Jake's since they were kids. Their dads had worked together for years. She had been a character witness at his trial, and she had been present at his sentencing hearing. And we've now reached a point where this case once again separates itself from the majority of cases that you'll hear about, because things from here take a very sharp political turn. So in the past, Marissa had been part of the LGBTQ plus community. And according to her own testimony on Jake's Facebook page, she came out as a lesbian to her parents at age 18. And she went on to struggle with her gender identity until she was 20, when she discovered that transgenderism was a thing. Marissa said transgenderism seemed to be the answer to my questions, my dreams, and my deep longing within me to be whole and complete. In her testimony, she goes on to say that after attending therapy for longer than the time that was required, she was approved for hormone therapy at age 20 to begin her transition to becoming male. But instead of being thrilled and excited, Marissa found herself struggling with alcoholism and just overcome with conflicting thoughts and emotions to the point where she was experiencing suicidal thoughts. It was during this period of conflict in her life that Marissa found the gospel and Jesus and became involved in Christianity, and she began fervently praying for her friend in jail, Jake. Jake says that one of the highlights during his time in prison was a day towards the end of his sentence when Marissa, who by this point in time was in the process of detransitioning and she was wearing women's clothes and growing out her hair, she came in to see him and spoke with him for about 3 hours about Jesus and the gospel. A few months later, when he was 28 years old, Jake was released from prison, and he and Marissa were married not much later. And a couple of months after their wedding, they were chilling out on the couch. Jake says he was watching YouTube on his phone, like you might be right now, and he came across a video about 11 men who were peacefully protesting by sitting down outside an abortion clinic in Louisville. In this video, these men were then arrested, and during the arrest, one of the men looked over at his son, who was watching the whole thing, and said, "How is your heart, son? This is your heritage." And Jake says that watching this moment, this exchange between father and son, broke him. It was this big defining moment for him. 3 weeks later, he says he and Marissa found themselves picketing outside Planned Parenthood, and the rest, as they say, is history. Today, Jake has his own ministry, primarily focused around his strong anti-abortion views. He has a Facebook page where he is very outspoken, to say the least. He describes himself not just as a pro-lifer, but as an abolitionist. For those of you unfamiliar with this term, abolitionists make up this kind of offshoot of the pro-life movement who, as a group, feel that pro-lifers aren't extreme enough. For instance, abolitionists like Jake disagree with heartbeat laws because he feels that they discriminate against what he calls preborn children who don't yet have a heartbeat. Jake has also said that he believes that those who have abortions should face the same punishment as those found guilty of first-degree murder, be it life in prison or even, depending on the state where the abortion was performed, the death penalty. And this is how Jake spends his life now, as a full-time, self-proclaimed human rights activist, spending, in his own words, thousands of hours protesting outside what he calls abortion mills, saving dozens of preborn babies. And he supports his family of 4 mainly with donations from supporters of his cause. Today, Jake says that if he could go back to the day of Craig's murder, he would speak up and fight for Craig the exact same way he fights for the preborn today. And while he's not allowed to contact Craig's family, he says he would love to sit with them to seek their forgiveness and share his sorrow that he still has over Craig's death. But I'm judging from their silence that the Sauger family are not on board with this sit-down chat. So final thoughts, and I'm not nervous, you're nervous. Firstly, we've spoken a lot about Jake, but that's not who this video is about. The victim here, of course, was Craig Sorger, who deserves so much more and had so much ahead of him. And my heart just breaks for his family, especially his mum. While I was researching Craig's case, what absolutely shattered me was that I was never able to find a definitive time of death for Craig. I did find a statement from one of Jake's lawyers where they claimed that the sentence of 14 years was too harsh because they alleged that Jake only picked up the stick and started hitting Craig after he was already dead. But apart from that, nothing. And so with nothing really concrete to go off, I'm haunted by this picture I have in my mind where Craig was still alive when the boys walked off. And while they were walking home cooking up a cover story, Craig was laying there alone, slowly bleeding to death in this trail that he had always been scared to walk down, getting colder and more afraid as darkness fell. And honestly, the idea that this was Craig's final moments will probably always haunt me. When it comes to Evan, I mean, there's not really a whole lot to say. Like I said, I can't even figure out if he's still in prison. Despite that letter that Jake wrote to Evan's mum after the sentencing, saying that Evan was innocent and that Jake had framed him, I don't know what that letter was about, but I do feel that Evan was the ringleader. And even if Jake's confession isn't 100% accurate, if there's details here and there that aren't true, I do feel that it is the closest thing to the truth that we will ever have surrounding Craig's murder. And then there's Jake. I am exhausted over Jake. I do genuinely feel that he is remorseful for his part in Craig's murder and that maybe this turn that his life took after his release might be his attempt to take that remorse and channel it into what he feels is a positive cause. Any irony that some people might see in a convicted child murderer becoming a full-time anti-abortion protester seems, to be honest, a little bit lost on Jake and those involved in his ministry. If anything, I get the feeling that Jake feels that Craig's murder has made him more effective in his cause because he's seen how delicate life is. And one of the big things he preaches is that if God can forgive him, God can forgive anyone, a sentiment that in his circles is very effective. While obviously my opinion on Jake's opinion is irrelevant in this video, I will say that I do take issue with Jake's chosen method of protesting. Like, Jake is that guy standing outside clinics holding a noisy bullhorn and holding up huge, confronting and traumatizing images, shouting at these women as they go in. And I just feel that there are much more empathetic and effective ways to voice your opinion. But Jake justifies this approach saying, and again, these are his words and not mine, but Jake says that if these preborns he's fighting to save were 2-year-olds being murdered in the thousands every year, then he's just reacting with the same outrage that anyone else would. But seeing as Jake himself has called out and tried to distance himself from pro-lifers that he says only care about the preborn and not the born, I guess, and that Jake himself is bringing 2-year-olds into the argument, I just have to quietly point out that in all of my research over the last few weeks and all my scrolling through Jake's Facebook page, watching all the videos of his testimony and sermons, guess how many instances I could find of Jake putting that same passion he uses to protest for hours and hours outside Planned Parenthood into making sure that these 2-year-olds that, again, he himself brought up have a semi-decent quality of life by pushing for reform in the foster care and adoption system or the welfare or school system. Or if he doesn't have time for that, just taking a quick second or two to put up a quick supportive post or publicly condone those that are fighting for reform in those systems. I'll give you a hint. That number in your head, just lower it. Lower. Lower again. There you go. But as usual, I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this case. How do you feel about Jake and Evan being tried as adults? Do you feel that Evan was proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Because remember, there was that kid, Cody, who said he was also there that day and Craig's blood was found on his clothes. So, I mean, it opens up questions, right? I really hope you guys enjoyed this video, even though I know it was a really heavy one. If you're still watching though, and you did enjoy it, remember to give it a thumbs up. Let me know that you stuck it out to the end. Also, if you are still sitting there listening to me ramble and you haven't already subscribed, then just take that plunge. Join this big best friendship we have going on here. I promise we're all really lovely and totally sane. Mostly. Anyway, Lily, you want to come say bye? Oh, hi. You did such a good job today. Do you want to sit up here? Are you going to take over? You here to say bye? You can say bye. They're just there. You did such a good job today at emotional support. 10 out of 10. I know there's a million gazillion other true crime videos you guys could have watched today. So I just want to say thank you so much for spending this time and hanging out with me and Lily today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and just know that me and Lily will be counting down the hours until we see you in the next one. Bye.